The Green Futures of Tycho by William Sleator, 13. Tycho couldn't help wondering about what had gone on in Ludwig's mind. After all, he had read Ludwig's description of the future. He had seen the egg on the floor. Tycho remembered those events himself, but Tycho had gone into the past and altered things so that those events would not occur. But what did that really mean? Had they happened or not? And how much did Ludwig remember? Had the events been completely wiped out, or did some memory of them still linger in his brain? He had experienced them, that is, if they had really happened. The situation was paradoxical and confusing, and now that the emergency was over, what he had done made Tycho uncomfortable. He tried to assure himself that all that mattered was the end result. Ludwig was convinced that he was having hallucinations and would no longer be suspicious of Tycho. One of his major problems had been eliminated. In a way, he was relieved. It was just so unfortunate that Ludwig had to believe he was incurably ill. The thought made Tycho feel rather sick himself, but it was Ludwig's own fault, argued another part of him. If he had just left Tycho alone, it would never have happened. Thinking about it all gave Tycho a strange, fuzzy headache. He wanted to get away and forget about the whole disorderly episode, and now, after his realization about chance, the future beckoned invitingly once again. Its pull, in fact, was irresistible. Something still gnawed at him about visiting the future, but he had little trouble pushing it away. It was essential that he keep going back until he found the best possible future for the rest of his family as well as for himself. It wasn't selfish at all. If he didn't go, they might all end up trapped in one of those terrible times. He was the only one who could prevent it. Now he knew better than to make the jump from his bedroom. The room would probably be completely different again, and he didn't want to risk ending up in the same space as some new piece of furniture. What would happen then? There was also the chance that he might arrive at the same future he had visited last time. If so, he wanted to be well out of the way of his enraged older self. When everyone was asleep, he went quietly downstairs and out to his spot behind the oak tree. His last trip had been short, only about half an hour, so he would set the dials to arrive at 3:15. He took the egg out of his pocket and was hardly surprised to see that it had changed again. Deep inside the green jewel, the shapes were now distinct, not drifting, but appearing to move quite purposefully. With difficulty, he dragged his eyes away from them to examine the middle. What he had thought were filaments were actually bands of little glittering cells, protruding slightly from the surface. There were 3 of them now, silver, red, and gold. When he examined them more closely, he saw that there was motion here too. Or perhaps it was just tiny lights flickering on and off, the way blinking lights on a neon sign create the impression of movement. Clearly the egg was becoming increasingly active. It chilled him, but he didn't want to think about what the activity might mean. He was getting better and better at avoiding certain things. He pressed down on the jewel, felt faint, and traveled 19 years, 363 days, 16 hours, and 15 minutes into the future. He had closed his eyes in preparation for the sudden appearance of the sun. Impatiently, he waited for them to adjust. This might be one of the good futures. The glare faded. He opened his eyes eagerly. The tree was gone. The grass was gone. He was standing on pavement. 1 inch from his nose was a solid wall. He backed away to get a better look. A new addition to the house filled what had once been the backyard. No attempt had been made to create a pleasing relationship between the old and new. The contrast in styles was jarring. Bringing them together this way made each structure look uglier than it would on its own. But when Tycho held up his hand to block out the old house, he found that he rather liked the new addition. It was made of some kind of gleaming green plastic and appeared to have been poured. If some thick viscous liquid, seething and boiling and bubbling, had suddenly gone solid, it might look like this. There were ripples and eddies across its surface, and unexpected indentations and protuberances. It made no geometrical sense at all. Tycho wondered briefly who had dreamed it up. He couldn't see anyone watching him from the old part of the house. He set the dials on the egg for a quick return, then slipped it into his pocket and started walking around the new structure. Was it intended to be beautiful, or was its shape determined by some function? And what could that function possibly be? He was hoping to find a window or a door, but he made a complete inspection without discovering either. It was totally sealed off from the outside, connected to the original building where the kitchen door had once been. The only way to get inside was through the old house, which he would now have to enter by the front door. No one seemed to have noticed him yet. Maybe the house was empty and he could get inside without any trouble. When he reached the side of the house, he turned back for another look. From this angle, he could see the top of the addition, a complex arrangement of curving metal rods, like a silvery spider web arched up toward the sky. As he watched, the rods undulated slightly, like delicate saplings moving in a breeze, only there was no breeze. He walked around the house and hurried up the front steps to find that the old wooden front door with its large window was gone. In its place was a solid opaque rectangle painted the same muddy green as the rest of the house. He pushed at the metal handle, then pulled. The door didn't budge. He tried again with all his strength. Nothing happened. The door was locked. It wasn't fair. To find that enticing, magical new structure and then to be unable to find out what it was for or even to get a glimpse inside was unbearably frustrating. So far, he had seen nothing ominous at all. This might well be one of the good futures. He couldn't allow himself to leave without finding out what was going on. Was he going to have to take the risk of climbing in one of the windows? He wasn't sure he even knew how to open them from the outside. He pulled and pushed at the door again, grunting. It was useless. Without much hope, he bent down to examine the keyhole under the handle. But was it even a keyhole? It resembled no lock he had ever seen before. It was not shaped like a key, and did not seem to have any parts that could move. It was merely a round indentation in the door, faceted like a miniature gelatin mold. He peered closer. There was something familiar about it. Where had he seen that shape before? His hand strayed to his pocket to grip the egg. Without really thinking about what he was doing, he pulled it out. Looking at it might make him feel better. He gazed down into the jewel. That was it. The jewel was the same shape as the indentation in the door. He pressed it into the hole. There was a slight sensation of suction or magnetic attraction as the jewel slipped snugly into place. He touched the handle. The door slid silently and effortlessly into the wall. So it was more than just a time travel device. It was a tool that could do other things as well. Apparently in this future, he had discovered what some of them were. If only the house would be empty now. There was probably so much he could find out inside. But the first thing he was aware of as he entered was footsteps on the second floor. Unfamiliar footsteps, halting and slow. If he was going to see much before he got caught, he would have to be very quiet and careful. This living room had the same bulbous green furniture sprouting like various fungi out of the floor and walls. But it looked years older now, faded and worn and not very clean. Lint and dust were everywhere. There was the large video screen, the lamps like tentacles looking chipped and scratched and rarely used, and the piano was gone. In its place was a large bacteria-shaped sculpture of some green jelly-like material with little white cacti growing out of it. The piano had been more attractive. Had Ludwig gone away and taken it with him? He could hear sounds that were probably supposed to be music, coming perhaps from a radio. Then there were more footsteps above, quicker than the others. They moved to the stairs and started down. The sculpture was ugly, but it made a convenient hiding place. Tycho crouched behind it. It was transparent enough to see through, distorting the world like a green funhouse mirror. Tamara appeared on the staircase, gnarled and pulsating through the plastic. She still had her hair in a bun, but her body had grown thick and graceless. She wore heavy practical shoes and a shapeless house dress. And though the day was warm, she was hunched inside a heavy sweater. Preoccupied, she moved through the rooms without a glance in Tycho's direction and disappeared into the kitchen. Tycho listened for a moment, then moved out from behind the sculpture and followed her. The sounds grew louder as he neared the kitchen. He stopped at the threshold and peered inside. The futuristic kitchen he had seen on his first trip already looked worn out. The once gleaming fixtures dull and grimy, an unappetizing smell of old fish and rancid grease lingered there. Tycho wrinkled his nose. Judy's kitchen had never smelled like that, but what difference did the kitchen make? It was the new addition he was interested in. He moved sideways against the kitchen wall as far as the refrigerator. Where the back door had been, there was now an arched green passageway, descending slightly, pressed against the curving side of the refrigerator. Tycho watched Tamara enter the passage. From his protected vantage point, he could see only the first few feet. Immediately, Tamara was lost from view. To see more, he would have to step out from behind his cover and risk exposure, but he had no choice. He had to find out what was inside that thing. If she noticed him, he could always escape. Slowly, he moved out from behind the refrigerator, and was so amazed by what he saw that he forgot to be careful at all. He just stood there and stared. Sunlight poured through the walls of the dome-like room, bathing everything in a green glow. Ludwig, gaunt at age 34, with only a thin fringe of pale hair, sat in the center of the room. He was almost completely surrounded by an electronic keyboard growing out of the floor. It had far more keys than a piano, and because of the way it curved around him, he could reach all of them easily. He played lethargically, a pained, stoic expression on his face, with no wonder. A slithering, shrieking noise pulled from the instrument like fingernails on a blackboard, accompanied by the hiss and plop of bubbling mud, with a piercing obligato of dentist drills. A spider web of metal rods, like the ones on the roof outside, hung from the ceiling directly over his head. The rods shivered and twitched with the same gasping, gulping rhythm as the music. Was it a kind of broadcasting device? Leonardo was ensconced in an alcove on the left. Though not quite as huge as the Leo Tycho had seen on the satellite, he was still obese. Pasty dewlaps hung from his face, and the flesh of his torso bulged over upon itself in quivering folds. He was working on a sculpture like the one in the living room, taking some slimy green stuff from a vat beside him and shaping it carefully with his pudgy hands. This sculpture was covered with veiny, wrinkled bumps and snout-like protuberances. There was a finished one on the shelf behind him that looked like a spiky sea anemone with several gaping, thick-lipped mouths. Tamara was just sitting down at a kind of counter on the other side of Ludwig. There was only one object on the counter. It was far more glittering and complex than the object in Tycho's pocket. Still, the jewel at one end of it was easily recognizable. Casually, Tamara picked it up, and Tycho felt an uneasy pang. What was Tamara doing with it, and where was his older self? Why didn't he have it? Leonardo looked up from his work for a moment. "Is Bobby feeling any better?" he asked. "No," Tamara said quietly. "I gave him an even larger dose. The pain seemed a little less when I left him. He was reading. I don't think it's going to last much longer." "The sooner the better," Leonardo said. "Judy was luckier. She gave up right away." "What about him?" Ludwig said grimly, still playing. "He's asleep," Tamara said, and looked at her watch. Instantly, Ludwig lifted his hands from the keyboard. "Be careful, Ludwig," Tamara hissed. "He could wake up any second. You know we're all linked together now. If he jolts you, I'll get it too." "I know that," Ludwig said, "but just listen. Isn't it worth it?" The relief from the sound of the keyboard was indeed blissful. I know, it's heavenly," Tamara said tensely, "but as soon as he notices..." "And now, just listen to this," said Ludwig, his face lighting up as he turned a knob and pressed a couple of buttons. "Ludwig, no, he'll hear you," pleaded Leonardo, but Ludwig wasn't listening. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and plunged into the revolutionary etude. Though the electronic sounds were thin and whining in comparison to the rich resonance of a real piano, Ludwig's passionate playing did give the music some depth. It was frightening to watch the tension of Tamara and Leonardo's faces, but as Ludwig continued to play, and nothing happened, they began visibly to relax. In the middle of the piece, Ludwig faltered, played some wrong notes, and stopped. He went back a few bars and tried again, and then again, but could not get beyond a certain point. He dropped his hands weakly to his sides and shook his head. "I've forgotten it," he said dully. "This fake instrument, playing all this garbage. It drives the real stuff out of my head." "Well, you better start playing it again," said Leonardo, picking up another handful of green stuff. "It was great while it lasted, but every minute the risk gets..." "No!" Ludwig said vehemently. "Who knows when I'll ever get another chance? Here's a piece I'll never forget." He began playing something soft and whimsical and slow. A glimnopide by Satie. "Oh," Tamara murmured. Her face softened, the furrows almost vanishing. "Oh, remember that piece? Remember how it was when you used to play that?" She lifted her eyes and turned toward her two brothers. You used to dance around the house when I played it, said Ludwig, smiling at her, his hands moving gracefully over the keys. Leonardo turned from his work with abrupt distaste and wiped off his hands on a cloth. That was when we had a yard instead of this ugly thing, he said, with grass and trees. And the top floor was mine, not his. I used to paint things on the walls. I remember, Ludwig said, nodding. You did a wonderful mural of a school cafeteria. I think I can still picture the food. Food, Leonardo said. He chuckled ironically. If only we'd known at the time. We never really appreciated enough. When I think of the kinds of things Judy used to make, Tycho heard the creak of a floorboard far above and the sound of a door opening. Was it his older self waking up? The others didn't seem to have heard it. And remember what Bobby and Judy were like then, Tamara said, her voice growing excited. They were so full of ideas and plans and hopes. Who ever thought they would just give up like they did when everything changed? When did everything start to change anyway, said Leonardo. It's so difficult to pinpoint it exactly. That's true, said Ludwig, still playing. It was so gradual. It had happened before we really noticed anything. But there was a time when even he was different. That's right, Tamara said, folding her arms across her chest and nodding. If I think really hard, I can see him as a child. Now, distinctly, Tycho heard footsteps on the attic stairs. It must be his older self coming down. Maybe he should warn them. But how? If only they would listen. But they were still lost in their reminiscences. Didn't he have a telescope or something, said Leonardo. Yes, said Ludwig, but he was interested in other things, too. He made a vegetable garden once. Remember how much we encouraged him and helped him with that? Tamara smiled. Remember how we all loved him so? She said warmly. He was the youngest. We adored him and babied him. We wanted to help him with everything. The footsteps were now on their way down to the first floor. Tycho's stomach went cold. He wanted to run, but panic and indecision kept him frozen on the threshold. They had to be warned. But how could he do it without giving himself away? We sure did baby him, Leonardo was saying. We used to argue about who got to play with him and take care of him and teach him things. I remember feeling so proud and happy every time he learned something new. And we used to get angry at Bobby and Judy whenever they disciplined him, even slightly, said Ludwig. We thought they should let him do anything. Tycho entered the kitchen from the dining room. There was another entrance from the far hall. The footsteps were there now. Quickly, Tycho stepped back toward the dining room and crouched down behind the refrigerator again. He wasn't really hidden, but there was at least a chance he might not be noticed here. The footsteps moved quietly across the kitchen. Tycho saw a man walk past the refrigerator. He didn't see Tycho, and Tycho couldn't tell whether it was his older self or not, for the man was wearing a mask. It was a green plastic mask that fit tightly over his face, with slits for the eyes, nose, and mouth. The man had a bulging pack on his back, from which sprouted a thick cord attached to some kind of device in his hand. He entered the green passageway. That's right, Tamara was saying. I remember how I used to love hugging him so much. Then she screamed. Ludwig and Leonardo were screaming too. Tycho felt like screaming himself as he listened to the tortured cries that ripped harshly out of their throats. When at last they stopped, he could hear them gasping for breath. He didn't want to look. He couldn't bear it. But before he knew what he was doing, he was standing up, looking into the passageway again. The man stood in the center of the room, his back to Tycho. Ludwig, Tamara, and Leonardo, their faces shocking white, were bent over in pain. Oh, it's so hard, Tycho. Ludwig managed to croak, his hand clutching his gut. You didn't have to make it so hard. But oh, my brother, came a soapy, syrupy voice from behind the mask. You make me so sad, and I try to be merciful. That was only a 2. You must strengthen yourself to be able to withstand a force of 10 if you continue to play that nasty, evil stuff I heard. But Tycho, Tamara pleaded brokenly, it was only a little rest, just a moment to relax. We're trying to do what you want, we really are. Don't we at least deserve a moment of peace? Peace! The voice was rich and condescending, as though he were talking to a child. But the more you backtrack like that, the farther away the true peace we are searching will be. When you disobey me, we lose days, we lose weeks. Oh, how I wish you could understand. I have told you again and again. Leonardo had mechanically dipped his hands into the vat and was sculpting again. All right, Tycho, but we're trying so hard. We're working as fast as we can. Ah, but it is still not fast enough. The voice took on an inspirational resonance. The mask tilted upward in one hand, gestured nobly. We are trying to open a new fabric in the earth, a new texture, a new doorway. The others glared at each other, quickly embarrassed. And it takes time, my brothers and sister, lots of time, and I am afraid there is not very much time left. What is the matter, Ludwig? Must you force me to give you a taste of number 6? Ludwig placed his hands on the keyboard. The retching, sickening sounds began again. The rods hanging from the ceiling quivered. His back still to Tycho, the man in the mask bent over Tamara. I have tried to protect you, my dear. I try so hard, but now I am afraid that you no longer deserve it. He pulled off the mask and threw it to the ground. Tamara squeezed her eyes shut and twisted her head away from him, her mouth tightening. All Tycho could see was the back of his head. There is no need to malinger, he said to her. And now, please tell me what time you need. Between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock, she said faintly, picking up the thing on the counter. The man made an adjustment on the device in his hand. So that was why he permitted Tamara to have her own duplicate of the egg. She couldn't use it to escape. It was under the control of the one in his pack. Tamara pressed down on the green egg and vanished. In an instant, she returned, holding another egg in her other hand. She slipped it into a compartment in a large crate beside the counter. She pressed down on the green end and vanished, returning in a moment with another duplicate of the egg. She slipped it into a compartment and vanished again. It took Tycho only a moment to figure out what she was doing. She was using the egg to make copies of itself. All she had to do was leave it sitting on the counter between 12 and 1, and then at a later time she would go back to 12:59 and pick up the one that was there. She would bring it back, then go and get the one at 12:58 and bring that one back. In this way, she could easily make infinite copies of it. But for what reason? What was his older self going to do with them all? Going to do with all of them? His older self, meanwhile, had mounted a dais at the back end of the room in the kitchen. Tycho felt feverish and sick. Watching this little scene was like banging his head against a cement wall. He longed to get away, and yet something held him there. His older self had still not turned around. What was it that had made Tamara cringe when he had removed the mask? The adult Tycho plunged his control device into the wall, plugged his control device into the wall. A video screen appeared out of nowhere. The shadowy shapes on it were meaningless and vague, and Tycho could make nothing of them, but his older self studied them intensely, occasionally making notes on a pad he had taken out of his pack. After several minutes, he turned off the screen and made some calculations. He went over them carefully. He thought for a moment, glanced at the pad again, and turned to Leonardo as if to check on what he was doing. Then Tycho saw his face. It was his own face, looking older than ever, but Tycho barely noticed the deep lines and the thinning hair. A dark, irregular stain like a birthmark wrinkled the skin from just below his left eye to the corner of his mouth. His lip withered where it met the stain, curving it slightly in a fixed sneer. It was his soul printed on his face. Tycho turned and ran from the kitchen. He pressed the thing into the indentation in the door and hurried outside. He rushed around to the back of the house. He found the spot where the oak tree must have been and placed himself well behind it. He checked the dials. It was late afternoon. Deep shadows hung over the only growing thing left in the yard, a great unkempt hedge against the back fence. Just as he was about to jump, Tycho noticed that the leaves were quivering slightly, but there was no wind. The air was oppressively stiff. It was as though some large animal were moving inside the hedge, rustling the foliage. Then there was a kind of wet hiss and a snuffling sound. Tycho returned to the oak tree and the night, and then he was sick on the grass. And that is the end of chapter 13.